In this paper, we argue that the architecture of 1970s Iran is best understood in light of the cultural significance of development, global circulation of ideas, expertise and technology, and local implementation in Iran gave rise to a reflexive engagement with tradition and identity discourse. In architecture, this manifested itself in debates over traditions and their contemporary relevance on the one hand. In architecture, this manifested itself in debates over traditions and their contemporary relevance on the one hand, and to references on tradition and traditional environments in modern designs on the other. The architecture of this period, like other fields, reflected a concern for the spatial representation and experience of cultural identity. The outcome of this experimentation would outlast the Pahlavi establishment and continue well into the 1990s, and in some cases even today. While not all 1970s Iranian architecture interpreted traditions, nevertheless, in its practice and education, the field was dominated by a concern for cultural identity, manifested in an increased attention to traditional forms and spaces that would be amplified following the Islamic Revolution. Here we argue that in responding to development and engagement with notions of tradition and identity, such architecture produced what we now know as heritage, which is defined as a cultural process involved in the making and dissemination of identities via the use of the past for present purposes. I will show some familiar examples to illustrate the nexus between development, architecture, and heritage, but I'm going to be very brief because of time constraints. Development in its present understanding is a post-World War II phenomenon. This timeline shows all the events that happened in Iran, and the highlighted part is, as you can see, very busy, is the period that we're looking at. In this period, it was concerned with the reconstruction and governance and entangled in international politics of the Cold War. Despite its Eurocentric origins, critique of development theory began in the early 1950s in the West, and the developing countries were not mere passive recipients of those developmental policies and doctrines at all. The origins of development in modernization, which is primarily understood in terms of capitalism and economic growth at the time, and its subsequent critiques give rise to the common reductionism of modernization being equated to westernization. In the early stages, development and modernization were almost interchangeable. That's how they were deployed. And they were concepts referring to pragmatic, technocratic, and policy-oriented processes driven by institutional, national, and international players. From the outset, an inextricable link between development and culture was assumed, according to the premise that economic growth would result in cultural change along Western models. So that was the starting point. However, initially, tradition was seen as the passive object of change. Consequently, its role was, in development was de-emphasized and was relegated to the realm of UNESCO and heritage and monuments and preservation, while development itself was understood as economic and financial in terms of planning, and was designated to institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This division of labor, as it were, continued well into the late 1970s. It was only in the late 1980s and concurrent with the redefinition of culture by scholars such as Geertz that the link between culture and development was taken seriously in institutional statements, despite the economist skepticism to that effect. In this new conception, culture was no longer passive, but a dynamic site of contestation, implicated in the processes of development, as I'm trying to show over here. Modernity, too, was reconceptualized as an historically and culturally specific phenomenon, locally situated and combining traditional traits with modern approaches. As a result, the scope and meaning of development expanded to include non-economic goals and outcomes. The entry of culture into the debate coincided with a critical challenge to Eurocentrism, the success of Asian economies, the recognition of the role of culture in peace and conflict resolution, and the rise of contestational theoretical perspectives. In our understanding, culture is rarely bound, understanding in this paper that is, but it is often influenced by factors at larger, even transnational scales, and is thus dynamically linked to politics and economics. But the time we are examining is just before these developments in theoretical fields. The Pahlavi government's White Revolution, which was just discussed, can be understood at least initially through the lens of modernization theory, responding to post-war American aid programs. But it was very much an Iranian plan that responded but was not dictated by foreign agendas. Indeed, considering the broader cultural discourses of the late 1960s and 70s complicates the understanding of the program as a mere imposition of Western cultural hegemony. The programs of development, including those with an architectural outcome, were bound to be realized in complex, unpredictable forms, a quality of globalizing projects in local settings that Singh identifies as friction and results in engaged universals. Friction is embedded, she says, in local culture and designates an intimate cultural exchange rather than an inward-looking resistance. This process is apparent in transformations in the field of architecture in an environment where development has instigated broad social change, and its concomitant cultural effects can be seen in the practice and education of architecture. Now, our hypothesis is that in late 20th century Iran, notions of architectural heritage arose from the nexus between development, culture, and architectural design. What created and sustained this nexus was the circulation of expertise, ideas, technologies, and materials. Design here is the key term. Heritage was conceived through design. Development induced a degree of cultural change, or at least varying degrees of historical awareness in society about Iranian culture, particularly among the elite. This historical awareness provided an impetus for engagement with and redefinition of tradition and fabrication of continuities with the past, which is by definition a heritage process. This attention to tradition and the past is indexical of the process of detraditionalization, which means removing the immediacy of tradition from daily experience, mediated experience, and also rationalizing and bringing it into consciousness. This attention to tradition and the past is indexical of that process in which the mediatization of culture plays a significant role. And here we can see architecture as a kind of spatial medium. The architecture of this period of sustained growth, as those graphs show, in Iran comes on the back of a decade of UN-sponsored development and a growing awareness of the global south, as it were, including Iran, of the necessity to push for opportunities for regional growth in a world that was divided by the Cold War. In Iran, this translated into urbanization and increasing internal migration, but also an attendant significance of symbolic aspects of urban architectural projects, representing a culture in transition as it deals with the globalizing projects of development. These projects deploy cultural memories, answering to a nostalgia for a real or imagined past among sections of the population, some of them amongst the people that the lady just mentioned, but at the same time, attempt to operationalize modernity in daily life. What is, on closer inspection, apparent in the works that I'm about to show is a reassembly of tradition, and with it a recall and perhaps reinvention of its vocabulary. Despite predominantly static perceptions of culture and at the time, in the 70s, in practice, architects and artists were experimenting with adapting global techniques and theories to local environmental and cultural contexts. Iran at the time was akin to a laboratory where embryonic ideas for historicism and regionalism in architecture were critically examined and put to the test in construction projects, foreshadowing subsequent international developments as well as what we now recognize as heritage processes. I will now discuss examples in order to demonstrate how our hypothesis pans out on the ground. In the first example, I'm looking at a series of conferences between 1970 to 1976, which were discussing architecture. These are international congresses of architecture. The first one was titled Interaction Between Tradition and Technology, 1970 in Isfahan, as that slide shows. The second one was Quality of Life, the role of industrialization in the architecture and urban planning of developing countries, in Persepolis, 1974, and there was a third one about women in architecture. I'll just briefly refer to these. As you can see, these are international congresses. The central theme of Isfahan conference was stated as investigating the mutual impact of tradition and technology. The topics and the selection of delegates reflected a desire for a truly global exchange. A significant theme was the critique of modernist technocratic approaches to housing and urban planning, and a positive re-evaluation of a local cultural tradition. In this respect, it was a means for articulating and codifying existing strategies within the country for the reconciliation of modernization with local traditional practices. The Second Congress also dealt with, and I'll just briefly state, also dealt with issues of habitat. The paper bit that you see is an advertisement of the things that were happening. It foreshadowed the developments in what became, in Canada, the Habitat Bill of Rights. They actually produced that in 1976. And the right picture is, of course, a North African example by Doxiadis. So there's all roots, and these are people who participated in this. These are their international roots for all these thinking. And the third one was, amongst other things, dealing with women's emancipation, which was amongst the themes of the White Revolution. So amongst I'm just skipping through this, the objective of these congresses from an Iranian perspective appears to have been coming to terms with modernization, resolving the dilemma of how to maintain a sense of national identity and learning from traditional forms and structures to develop new culturally appropriate models of architecture, particularly in housing. Arguably, these objectives were in line with ideas of national development. The Congress's appeal to authenticity was, of course, actually syncretic, combining aspects from pre-Islamic and Islamic past in a synthesis of romantic nationalism. This becomes apparent in an example that I'm going to show of housing by Kamran Diba, which is mostly familiar to most of you guys, perhaps. For the Iranian architect Diba, the spatial aesthetic unity of the traditional village reflected a social consensus reached over time. So the village is a big thing for these people as they discuss it, both the foreigners and the Iranians. While the foreign and Iranian delegates did not share a uniform approach to the question of tradition, there was nonetheless the call for an organic unity and continuity of habitat between the individual and communal scales. It is noteworthy that at the time, UN was also very worried about the impacts of development and constantly talked about the issues of organic unity and the rest. So these are apparent in UN declarations as well. Here, the common ground was a narrative of loss of center associated with the modern city, which, as Tafuri, the architectural historian, noted, was common to both radical and conservative modernist and anti-modernist cultural commentators. Plenty of them, of course, we had, in which the protagonists substituted order and universality for historical perspective. In other words, a kind of metaphysicality. The genesis of the Shushtar project lay in the governmental plans for regional development aimed at combining modern technology and industry with the preservation of traditional cultures. So when people have moved, in short, they can be in an environment that invokes certain senses of memory, however vaguely, so that memory can be reconstituted. So I'm going to skip again, just to save time a little bit. That plan, that project, subsequently goes to win the Aga Khan Award for Islamic architecture, and despite the fact that it was beset by unforeseeable and unforeseen problems because there was war, massive internal migration due to war and the rest of it, it still wins because of its faithfulness to tradition and heritage, it says the panel, and its harmony and its creation of culturally appropriate spaces. Effectively, Diba tried to reimagine and cultivate traditional communal experiences inspired both by locality, and a psychological understanding of design processes. He attempted to design appropriate habitat for factory employees and workers. The ideas, the design knowledge and approach were indeed rooted not in indigenous practices of building, some of which were obsolete at the time, but in theories of environmental design developed in America. I've got another example of the Azadi Tower. I'm going to briefly just state what it's about. In the paper, we explained that how this brings the universal and the local together and forges a form of cultural heritage, iconic cultural heritage, but it also works on a universal level by locating the gateway of Tehran, coalescing movements of traffic of various kinds at various scales, from aerial traffic to local traffic, which means that this becomes a hub. And in doing so, it actually intensifies the significance of the monument beyond ideological perceptions. And therefore, it still stands as an iconic place, regardless of any ideological projections by any state. and it's recognized. We've done photo elicitation to that effect around the country. So, skipping forward, the final example that I'm going to show is by famous architect Nadir Ardalan, which is the School of Management in Tehran between 1972 and 75. Its overall layout and detailed plans make explicit references to traditional and religious madrasas in Iran. Ardalan's approach, interpreting archetypal forms, derived from his jointly written book with his wife on traditional Iranian architecture. Thus, the project deploys patterns such as Charbagh Garden and the Hujre, etc., although the actual buildings also seem much indebted to Louis Kahn, the famous Jewish American architect who had attended the 1970 congresses upon his invitation. The faculty has since the revolution turned into an elite training university for the ideologically committed. The project also reveals the operations of transnational transference of scientific expertise through which Iran was opening up to a global network of knowledge and techniques. Thus, the Iranian School of Management was based upon the blueprint of the Harvard Business School. Similar collaborations took place with other American and European universities. This collaboration, and collaborations such as this one, can be seen in light of the American Point 4 and 8 programs and the role of the Ford Foundation and MIT Center for International Studies, a think tank substantially funded by the CIA and military in programs that were immediately related to the American containment policy related to the Soviet Union and China. Although it's not just that. However, what I'm trying to say is here that there was again an Iranian culturalist agenda. At Abu Ali Sina, another example, and at the Iranian School of Management and Dibaz buildings for Jondi Shapur University in Ahvaz, traditional architectural garden and urban forms were redeployed to give form to modern programs. The image, if not essence, of tradition was conveyed, again as a form of reflective nostalgia, which I'm about to explain what it means. Each of these examples made explicit figurative references to Iran's architectural traditions at various scales. But why is there such a proliferation of attention to tradition and the past in this period? What prompted this rising interest, and how is that to be interpreted in relation to other changes in the country, and how is this related to heritage? From interviews we conduct with some architects from the period and examination of various projects, we believe that arguments that assert such designs to have represented a cultural resistance to the outside world, attractive as they may sound, are misleading. Indeed, many design practices, methodologies, even figurative aspects, as well as schools of thought, were borrowed directly from overseas and implemented in the Iranian context, as were construction technologies, notably for the Shahyad Monument, which was the first of its kind to be done by CAD/CAM design and computer-aided design technologies, fabrication technologies. Secondly, it would be erroneous to reduce the references to tradition to nostalgia, although nostalgia does play a part here. As Boehm points out, nostalgia is a modern feeling that can be cultivated and mediates between local and the universal. Boehm's useful distinction between reflective and restorative nostalgia, the former pertaining to a looking back in the process of acting in the present, and the latter constituting a reactionary impulse aimed at the restoration of the past, opens up the possibility of nostalgia taking on a productive role in which heritage is deployed in the present as a kind of patricinium. Avoiding customary power-based explanations, with our dear Foucault, we argue that the architectural programmatic experimentation in this period was prompted by the local effects, but I'm getting there, by the local effects of the globalizing project of development. By the time these projects were conceived, Iran had prerequisites of rapid economic growth, effective planning, and freedom from debt, factors powered by the international rise of oil prices as mentioned. Iranian economic growth and its national development model were mainly focused upon urbanization and industrialization processes, which translated into population drift from villages and peripheral districts towards larger cities, Tehran in particular. Massive population movement was also a major cultural change, provoking a widespread sense of displacement, as we can see in many nostalgic writings by intellectuals of the time, many of whom were moving between cultures of Iran and the West. Within this environment, both displacement and exchange, the architecture of this time was developed through the agency of individuals as well as systemic affordances, such as the official desire for modernization and development. These individuals, one page. These individuals were, by and large, expatriate Iranians, foreign educated, they were married to foreigners, and they were cooperating with foreign firms. So, the central point here was cultural change in the society. Social change was happening as an inevitable result of development. On a mass level, what these architects and designers brought to the fore was maybe interpreted as an attempt towards capturing, facilitating, and producing cultural change with reference to traditions. Architectural design functioned as a technique of mediation, deploying deliberate mimetic strategies towards concrete, visual, and corporal spatial outcomes intended to facilitate cultural change, historical and temporal change. This should not be misunderstood as concrete top-down cultural policy, still less the product of the Shah's megalomania. There is little historical evidence for any of these. In any case, just to talk about this as a final conclusion, what I'm about to suggest is that what happened in this context is interaction with the outside globalizing projects creates a new sense of historical appreciation and historical perception, and that gives rise to cultural heritage, which is manifested in architectural design. Thank you very much.